Hello and welcome to the 46th Geopolitical Economy Hour, the show that examines the fast-changing political and geopolitical economy of our times. I'm your host, Radhika Desai. So what just happened in the Canadian election? Has Mark Carney, allegedly the seasoned handler of crises, now performed a miracle, taking the Liberal Party, which as late as December 2024 was kissing the 20% mark in its unpopularity ratings, with the Conservatives under Pierre Poilievre soaring into the high 40s, leaving an unprecedented 27 percentage points between them. So has Mark Carney taken this Liberal Party from certain defeat to heady victory and a fourth historic term by inspiring the trust and confidence of Canadian voters as the leader able to stand up to Trump? Or is it that despite being burdened by the similarity to Trump that he had hitherto so assiduously cultivated and which had become increasingly a liability, Pierre Poilievre managed to prevent the Liberals from getting a majority and, notwithstanding the loss of his own seat, delivered the best performance for the Canadian Conservatives in their present form ever, and the best for the Canadian right since Mulroney had taken its vote share to a little over 50%. Or is it yet that the Canadian election was a Trump triumph? He had dominated the election so completely that a Financial Times commentator called Carney the un-Trump, explaining that by coveting Canada's sovereignty, Trump had turned the semi-Trumpian Conservative Party's projected landslide into a defeat in the space of weeks. Not bad for a US president's first 100 days. He might do a similar favor to Australia's incumbent Labour Party this weekend without even threatening to annex the country. Those are the words of the FT commentator. And indeed, we may note that Prime Minister Albanese of Australia was among the first to congratulate Mr. Carney. Or is the story the opposite, that notwithstanding his looming presence in the election, Trump failed to deliver a Liberal majority? Or is it also further that this is the last gasp of the NDP, the Greens, and possibly even the Bloc Québécois, all of whom bled votes to the Liberals and to a lesser extent also the Conservatives, because these mechanisms essentially made this the most purely two-party contest to be seen in decades. So with me to unravel the result of this election, just as we had dissected the campaign a few weeks ago, is Dimitri Lascaris, journalist, public figure, lawyer, and all-round Canadian intellectual. Welcome, Dimitri.
Always a pleasure to be with you, Radhika. Thank you for having me.
So, Dimitri, what do you think is the main story emerging from these election results?
It's hard to say. I want to sort of begin by tackling this notion that Trump's appearance suddenly turned the tide. I don't think that is a plausible explanation for what has happened. As I recall, Radhika, and I know you have the figures at hand, in December, the Conservatives were crushing the Liberals. As I recall, the Conservatives were in the low 40s and the Liberals were in the low 20s. So there was a huge shift in voter sentiment between December and the election. Now, the second point I would make is that Trump had already been elected by December. Canadians knew that Trump was going to be the president of the United States. They knew that Trump had been talking, if anybody was paying attention to the US election, and a lot of Canadians were, that he was talking about how much he loved tariffs and that he was going to slap, all of the countries with which the United States had a substantial trade deficit, such as Canada, with some very large tariffs. So none of this was a surprise. And the other thing I think is notable that undermines this narrative that it's all about Trump. If we go to that slide from I think it was the Abacus poll that was done just before voting day, which showed the most important factors for Canadians in their voting decisions. Let me see if I can pull that up here. So you see, this is just before voting day. The most important factors, which two of these are most important in deciding how you will vote? Okay, 30% said that dealing with Donald Trump and the impact of his decisions was one of the two, not necessarily the most important, but one of the two most important factors when deciding how to vote. Now, if we could look at that slide, Radhika, I don't know where it is, which shows, this is it, party best able to handle dealing with Donald Trump. Okay, 45% said the Liberals and 34% said the Conservatives. So there's an 11-point differential. It's not huge, significant, but huge. And only 30% of voters said that this issue was one of the two most important factors for them. I don't, I'm not doing any complex math here, but I think we can say with a lot of confidence that these two data points, how many Canadians thought dealing with Trump was one of the two most important factors in deciding how would they vote, and the differential between, Carney and Poilievre when it came to who's best suited to handle Trump. And we throw into the mix this whole point that I made at the outset that Canadians already knew that Trump was going to be the president before December. This cannot possibly explain this massive swing. It's a factor, yes. Maybe even a significant factor, but there's a lot more going on. And the question then becomes, what is that lot more? I personally think a lot of it has to do, unfortunately, and I hope I'm wrong about this, with superficial considerations. The fact is that Prime Minister Trudeau was deeply unpopular by the time we get to December. But it's also true that Poilievre was not a likable figure. People had a lot of reservations with him, and a lot of his support, I think, was very soft. It was people who were choosing him simply because they were sick of Trudeau. And all the Liberals had to do was present a new face to the public who was a credible figure, which Carney is perceived to be because he was the, you talked about this persona that he has of the crisis manager, and he was the governor of the Bank of England or Canada during the financial crisis. He comes across as a person who is a bit statesman-like. People weren't sick of him. He was new. And so all of a sudden, when he was presented to the public as an option to call Poilievre, we found out how shallow the support for Poilievre actually was. And it collapsed. Collapse is too strong a word, but it fell enough for Carney to soar into the lead. And, other contributing factors to this, there was, I think, very likely to have been a significant degree of strategic voting, because Poilievre was so unlikable to people in the center and particularly on the left. Frankly, the NDP and the Greens did a terrible job of presenting a viable and meaningful alternative to the politics of the Liberals. They, as we've discussed previously on this excellent program, their tendency is to place themselves modestly to the left of the Liberals. That's always been their strategy, and it's become increasingly pronounced over the years. And so they really failed to distinguish themselves from Carney and the Liberals. And so people gravitated quite easily to the Liberals in order to prevent a Conservative victory. I think that probably explains this really quite enormous swing in the vote. I certainly don't believe it's all about Trump, or even mostly about Trump. I just think Trump is one of many factors that were at play here.
Okay, yeah. So I think you raise an absolutely excellent point about Pierre Poilievre. I think you zero in on a very important fact that basically the dislike of Trudeau had become so great that people were willing to essentially go for Poilievre, or, more people were willing to go for Poilievre than would normally have done. And I think that when that excess of people who supported him disappeared, then he was essentially unable to, achieve the victory that seemed to be his. It seemed to be his for the asking back in December. Now, having said that, I would also like to say that I think you're right, of course, that it isn't just Trump, but I think, and it is also that as I tried to sort of indicate this in the introduction, I said, did Trump fail? Because, you could interpret it that way, that, Trump was supposed to have given the Liberals a a majority on a silver platter, but he didn't. So I think that something very interesting is happening. So on the one hand, it's very clear that Trump was elected very early on. He started talking about tariffs. He started treating Justin Trudeau in a very uncouth way, calling him Governor Trudeau and blah, blah, and so on. And so all of these things had definitely happened. But all this while, Trudeau was still prime minister. So the Liberals' support was not very high. Then Chrystia Freeland, of course, resigned. And you see, from an early point, the Liberals knew that their way of digging themselves out of the hole that they were in, or pulling themselves out of the hole they were in, was to make Trump an issue. Chrystia Freeland made Trump an issue in her resignation letter. And then, of course, this was just before the Christmas break. And as soon as Christmas break ended, as you know, Justin Trudeau, I think on the 6th of January or something like that, announced his resignation. And then it began to be put about that Mark Carney was going to run for the leadership. And it is from this point on that the Liberal leadership figures were going up. Because right from the beginning, they were, again, the story, the narrative that always hung around Carney's candidature for the leadership of the party and then subsequently in the election campaign is, I'm a pair of safe hands, I've handled crises before, I'm the person to stand up to Trump. And even, as you know, a few days ago, there was some discussion about the fact that there had been another phone call between Trump and Carney just before the election. And that, so in this, what Carney was anxious to, the story, the angle that Carney wanted to pursue in this was to say that Trump treated me with respect, that Trump respects me, and that I can do a good deal with Trump. And so this has also, so Trump was actually, in a certain sense, Trump could have been could have been a very marginal presence in the Canadian election. But the entire effort of the Liberal Party was to make him the issue, because that was the only way they could get elected, that they could be seen as the party to support. So I just wanted to say that, but otherwise I agree with you. And I think what's really interesting, however, considering what you said about Poilievre's unattractiveness, and all those things, his tendency to come across as somebody who is just a kind of badger. He keeps badgering people, and that's all he can do.
Right.
But
Very
despite
Constantly,
that, he delivered an amazing, historic, I would say, electoral performance in terms of the share of the vote.
Well, the Conservatives did. I'm not so sure that Poilievre did.
Sure.
I think Poilievre held them back.
Agreed. Yes.
There's a lot of there is clearly a very high degree of support for what the Conservative Party has come to represent today, which is quite troubling to those of us on the left. I don't think we can deny that. It is a pronounced level of support for a party that has moved ever more to the right and has become, in numerous respects, Trumpist. And we should be very concerned about that as leftists. But I don't think it was Poilievre. I think it was the Conservative Party. And
that's a very good distinction, and I think we should make it. But I think that the earlier point you were making, that essentially the Conservatives are becoming Trumpists, I think this is the key point. And I think it's also in Canada's case, it's manifesting itself in a way that I feel really endangers Canadian unity. Let me just share the map of Canada's unity as a country. So if you see this map, this is the map of the election results. And as you can see, there is an extremely pronounced regional pattern to the election results. So the Liberals have basically got the Maritimes, Quebec, and substantial parts of Ontario. And then, these very big empty northern constituencies, which are in terms of size very big. Liberals have also, what you can't see here is, of course, got the big cities, whether it's Vancouver or Montreal or etc. Liberals have done well in the big cities, but you can see here that the pronounced Western orientation of the conservative support. The only qualification to this is that a substantial part of Ontario has gone over to the Conservatives to a greater extent than before. So I would say that this, particularly given that this is Trumpist, and one of the characteristics of the Trumpist tendency in today's politics is the entrenched support that people have. There are essentially people who will vote for Trump even if he, I think he himself once said he could shoot a man in the street and people would still vote for him. So I think that kind of entrenchment of a certain kind of right-wing support base is a very important element in the current situation.
Indeed it is. What does this all mean for, those of us who want to have a country that is humane and democratic, peaceful, egalitarian, prioritizes the interests of the poor and the working class? It's not a good sign, Radhika. Not a good sign.
Not at all. Not at all. And here's since we've been talking all this while, but let's also just share the result, because I have a question for you from the results. So here are the results as we know them now. Counting is not completely finished. So you see that in the case of, in each case, in the case of the Liberals, for example, the top line there, you see the dark red and then the pink colored bit of the bar. And then you see that represents the fact that 155 Liberals have been elected. The Liberals are leading in 13 more seats. So they are likely to get, but we are not sure, 168 seats. 172 seats would be necessary for a bare majority. And of course, the Conservatives remain far short of that. 133 Conservatives have been elected. They are leading in 11, so they will have 144 seats if they win all the ones they are leading in. And the share of the vote is much narrower than this. It's 43.5% so far for the Liberals and 41.4% for the Conservatives. So now, clearly, the Liberals are going to need somebody's support in order to form a government. And the question becomes, Dimitri, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think the NDP is once again going to prop up the Liberals? I mean, and how is this going to all sort of, work out, given that the NDP has paid a very big price for supporting the Liberals in this election?
Well, I think that this is actually, if you had to govern with a minority, I think that this is pretty good distribution of seats for the Liberal Party. The New Democratic Party, I mean, first of all, the Liberals have options. They don't have to rely upon the New Democratic Party to get parts of their platform passed. So, for example, if they want to destroy the carbon tax, the Conservatives would be happy to go along with them. If they want to adopt some language, to please some kind of legislation that is oriented towards their strong base within Quebec, recognizes the French language rights of Quebecers, for example, they can probably attract support from the Bloc Québécois. If they want to put in some kind of a progressive program, a piece of legislation, the NDP will do the trick. The Greens, of course, are a non-factor. Their support is absolutely meaningless with one seat. But they could play off these various parties, given the politics and the priorities of the Liberals, which are very similar to those of the Conservatives. And given that the NDP, as I say, has always just positioned itself slightly to the left of the Liberals, I think that there are a lot of alternatives for them, depending on what particular legislative scheme they're putting forward. And because the NDP has so few votes, and because the Liberals have alternatives in terms of getting aspects of their platform passed, the NDP has almost no leverage. So they're going to be able to accomplish a lot less this time around by supporting the Liberals on various issues than they would have accomplished last time around. And they didn't accomplish a hell of a lot, frankly. I think they were in a much stronger position that they were willing to acknowledge. They could have pushed the Liberals harder to the left. They blew it. And I think that's part of the reason why they got eviscerated. And now they're in a very, very weak position. And to the extent that they have any kind of impact whatsoever on the legislative priorities of the Liberals, it ain't going to be much. It's going to be a lot less than it was in the last one.
Of course, yeah, and it seems, and this is another really interesting chart to look at. It seems as though, as I was saying, like this, in this election, this is the change in the vote share since the last election, and the Liberals, of course, gained the most, nearly 11%. The Conservatives gained 7.7%, and all the other parties lost. The Green Party, of course, they never had much of the vote share to begin with, so they lost. Not very much. Same for Bloc Québécois. The People's Party lost votes, but the NDP lost the most. So it really, I mean, what do you make of this? I mean, what's happening on the Canadian party political scene? Will these other parties ever make a comeback?
Proportionately, I think the result for the Greens was almost as catastrophic as it was for the NDP, because the Greens got 2.3% in the last election. So their support plummeted by almost 50%. Yeah. It just looks small because they were starting from such a low level after the disastrous Enemy Paul tenure in 2022. But the NDP suffered a bigger loss. I think their popular vote support was around 20%. So they lost more than 50% of their support. I think the Greens, frankly, Radhika, are on the way to extinction. It's sad to say, for those of your viewers who don't know, I ran to be leader of the Green Party of Canada 2020. You were the head of my platform committee. We came very close to winning. We gave the base of the party a distinct, I think, rather historic eco-socialist alternative, something Canadian politics, not at least the parties that have representation in Parliament, had seen in a long time, if ever. And we came very close to winning. And ever since then, it's been all downhill for the Green Party of Canada. And now their one and only MP is Elizabeth May, whom I often refer to as the leader for life. She is the longest serving leader of any party by far in Canada's Parliament. She's given no indication that she is going to resign, even though she should, because of the catastrophic nature of this outcome. This is the lowest share of the popular vote that the Green Party has obtained, going at least all the way back to 2004. Now, I don't know if you managed to find the popular vote figures for elections prior to 2004.
Yes, I actually did, and I can share them. Give me a second. Half a second, share.
I found popular vote figures, but none that broke out the Green Party separately. I think they were...
Yeah, no, here's the Green Party. It's in the Wikipedia Green Party entry. And you can see here that, of course, through most of the 80s and into the 2000s, they didn't really have any representation. But beginning in 2011, they won their first seat. And of course, here, there is actually, there are vote share figures here, percentage of the vote. So the highest percentage is here at 2008, 6.78%. And then and in 2019, they got 6.55%. I think that's when, I think you were quite involved in the Green Party, Dimitri. And then, it went down again in 2021, and in 2020, well, they haven't put the figure in for 2025, but it'll be lower. At least one percentage point lower than the 2.33 you see there for 2021.
So you see that the lowest, 1.2%, is substantially lower than anything going all the way back to the 2000 election. That's the last time they got lower than 1.2%.
That's correct. That's what you were trying to say. Yeah. So this is the high point. But the previous low, which beats the current low, is in 2000. You're absolutely right.
So we're talking a quarter of a century. They have not had a result this low. I think this is a raging indictment of Elizabeth May, and sort of just, to put a little bit of granularity on this, her co-leader, Jonathan Pedneau, ran in Outremont, and out of 5 candidates finished dead last. and she put him up. We have that. If you want to pull it up, it's in
Oh,
the.
I do. I'll show that. Hang on. In Uttrama. Here we go.
He got less than 10% of the vote.
Yeah, you can see here. That's right. 9.7%.
He was the face. I mean, if you look at the newspapers and the press conferences they did, Elizabeth May put him out in front. He was the face of the party, and he couldn't even, beat the NDP or the Bloc Québécois candidate in the riding of Outremont, which has been solidly liberal. Then you have Paul Manley. I think we have that chart as well over in the Nanaimo Ladysmith. There it is. So Paul Manley won the seat in 2019, and in 2021 under Annamie Paul, that was a train wreck of a year because Annamie Paul came in after winning the 2020 leadership contest, hired a chief spokesperson, a chief advisor and spokesperson by the name of Noah Zatzman, who was a fanatical, frothing at the mouth Zionist. And in the middle of 2021, when Israel began to attack Gaza again and started killing large numbers of civilians, Paul Manley and the third Green MP, Jenica Atwin, correctly described Israel as an apartheid state. And then Zatzman began vilifying them publicly, calling them anti-Semites. It was the most extraordinary thing I've ever seen. The leader of a party, her chief spokesperson, chief advisor and spokesperson, was calling two of their three MPs anti-Semites. And so he lost in the 2022 election. He tried to make a comeback, and he finished 2021, I'm sorry, and finished fourth in this riding. And in between that election and this election, he was serving as a councillor in Nanaimo. So he's very well known to the people there. This is a very disappointing result for the Greens. And then, of course, there's Mike Maurice, Kitchener Centre, was the only other Green MP during the last parliamentary session. Mike came very close to pulling this out of the hat, but with 212 polls reporting out of 213, it looks like he's lost, although he's not been declared the winner. So who's left standing? Leader for life. It's a terrible, terrible outcome for the Green Party of Canada. So on the NDP side, do you want to talk about that a little bit, or should we just...
No, NDP and then also Bloc, please.
Yes, so I haven't been following too carefully the granular results for the Bloc, but one of the Jagmeet Singh lost his own riding, and quite properly resigned. That was the right thing to do. But also somebody whom I supported in the 2019 election during a time that I wasn't part of the Green Party, the 2019 election, in the 2017 NDP leadership contest. At that point in time, I was a member of the NDP, and I supported Nikki Ashton. She lost in the riding of Churchill in Manitoba.
Yeah.
I believe Matthew Green has lost in Hamilton Centre. Last time I checked, he was losing there. A very young, popular with the left MP. And then Joel Harden in Ottawa, who has been an MPP for a long time, very, very widely admired amongst the left in this country. He lost in that riding as well, and in Ottawa Centre, where he's extremely well known to the electorate. So it's just all around a terrible outcome. And Avi Lewis in Vancouver Centre, NDP royalty of the Lewis family, and someone who was fearless in defending the Palestinian cause, unlike the elders in the Lewis family. He finished, I think, third or fourth in Vancouver Centre. Didn't even come close to winning. So a lot of really prominent players within the NDP are gone, and I just don't know who's going to come forward and lead that party. Who is a figure who can resurrect the NDP out of the ones who remain? Maybe Alexandre Boulerice, maybe Leah Gazan in Winnipeg Centre, but they didn't have quite the profile of these other persons that I've mentioned. The NDP too is at serious risk in the future.
And it also seems to me, going back to what we were looking at, the collapse in the support of all the other parties. It's really interesting. And so, I think that you certainly have a point that it's not completely about Trump, although my rejoinder, I'd agree with that, but then say, the Liberals definitely tried everything in their power to make him the main issue. But I think you also have a point where, Poilievre really made people afraid. And I think that that's partly why I'm sure that so between Trump and Poilievre, I think that enough people decided that they were going to play it safe by voting for the Liberals, which is, of course, always the typical Canadian dilemma. Should I really vote for the Greens or the NDP that I would like to? Or, given that this might just allow the Conservatives to get in, I should really vote for the Liberals, which is the logic that has always supported the Liberals. And I also wonder if something like that did not happen in Quebec, because it seems to me that again, the Trump factor, Poilievre factor, whatever, but the Bloc Québécois vote completely collapsed. Although, the leader of the Bloc certainly won his seat quite handsomely and so on. So that doesn't seem to have been a personal problem with him. So, yeah.
Yeah. But, I have to say, Radhika, I mean, my overall feeling about this election is, can we go back to that chart about what matters to Canadians? Because I just have to blow off some steam.
Sure, absolutely. Give me half a second.
So reducing your cost of living. The core causes of the increases in the cost of living are bipartisan. Okay, both the Conservatives and the Liberals policies that they have supported, and we can get into that if you'd like, but I just going down this list, and it's the same thing over and over again, making housing more affordable. Why has housing become unaffordable for so many Canadians? It's because of the policies that the Liberals and the Conservatives have pursued. Economic growth is not robust. Again, you could blame this on both the Liberals and the Conservatives quite legitimately. The deterioration in Canada's healthcare system. This is bipartisan. Both the Liberals and the Conservatives have slowly suffocated the healthcare system and have allowed private healthcare to become increasingly important in the provision of healthcare in this country. Managing the federal budget deficit and debt. They both, were engaged in fiscal mismanagement. Both of them have engaged in massive deficit spending. And, could have and should have increased taxes on the wealthy and corporations in order to better manage the finances of the country and generate revenue for making Canada a better place to live, which was a very important factor for 15%. So you go down this list, in my opinion, the primary culprits in virtually every case are both the Liberals and the Conservatives. And yet what did they do? The voters, they gave them collectively a historic level of support. The very people who are primarily to blame for the things that are most concerning to Canadians today were rewarded for their incompetence and their indifference to the desires of the voting public. And to what that says to me, Radhika, it's not a popular opinion, but it's something that I expressed the last time we talked about the Canadian election. There are a lot of people in Canada who make decisions on the basis of superficial considerations. And we have a voting public that is sadly a highly propagandized voting public. People place too much confidence in the mainstream, the so-called mainstream media, the corporate media. They're too gullible when it comes to the narratives being propagated by the corporate media and the political elite. And as a result, they have shot themselves in the foot yet again. These people are not going to deliver, and they should know this by now. So, these two parties have dominated federal politics for the entire post-World War II period.
What was really, yeah, absolutely. What was really interesting about those, most important factors that you used to vote is that the importance of all the major factors, the first five, 4 of the first 5, the importance of all those factors went down rather than up over the course of time. And that included standing up to Trump, which was interesting, So yeah, but I think that overall, I would say that, of course, the Canadian public doesn't seem to have voted, obviously very wisely. But the thing is, what alternative do they have? There was absolutely no political force in the fray that was offering a genuine alternative. It's basically either you get like the globalist elite, which creates the conditions under which the Trumpist a reaction sets in, or you go straight for the Trumpist reaction. I mean, these are the two options that people have. And so I think that what we are actually paying for today, and in fact, there has been a lot written about this, by scholars of politics across the board. I mean, that there is a profound crisis of party politics, and you can, in one way, a sort of sanitized way of putting it would be that parties seem to more and more share their policy platforms. I mean, look at the shameless way in which the Mark Carney campaign simply stole the Liberals' policy clothes, whether it was on taxation, whether it was on carbon tax or what have you, you name it, and they simply, so that's something we didn't mention, but that's a very important element of this. So both the major parties stand for more or less the same policies, with there being just some maniacally fringe elements to the Poilievre platform, but they are all neoliberal policies. They all create inequality. None of them are good at getting the economy going, reducing costs of anything, etc., etc. So you can put it in this way, that there is nothing to choose between Tweedledum and Tweedledee. There's a policy consensus across parties, but you could also put it more politically. Over the last 4 or 5 decades, what we have seen is the systematic destruction of any viable left politics, which is the only kind of politics which can truly answer this question. And, Dimitri, when you ran, of course, you really tried to present really a viable eco-socialist set of policies and an alternative, but of course, but in my humble opinion, I think the Canadian establishment and particularly the Green Party establishment did to you what they do these days to all progressive people. They call them anti-Semites, and that's it. They sink your campaign. So I think that the lack of a left is really interesting. And in this regard, I just want to share these turnout figures, and this is also very interesting. So here we have a graph with the latest turnout figures, and that goes back to 2004. And what you see here is that, while, of course, turnout was looks compared to the, since over the last 20 years, it seems slightly on the high side. But if you look at a longer term perspective, you see what the situation is. So this chart here that I have to show only goes to 2015, although we have the figures from 2015 onwards here, and you can see they're all roughly the same, varying between 68% and 63%. But if we look at this chart now, you can see that in elections going back to the 50s, you had consistently participation rates between about 57 to about the end of the 70s, you have participation rates that are between 70 and 80%. And with the onset of neoliberalism, with the arrival of Mulroney, the creation of a cross-party consensus in which the Chrétien liberals and the Martin liberals and everybody essentially adhere to the same neoliberal policies, essentially we have created a situation in which people feel, why bother to vote? If it doesn't matter who I vote for, I'm going to get the same policies. And this is the result. You see a remarkable level of disaffection. And if you take this into consideration and connect it with the fact that this was supposed to be an election about a national emergency caused by our gigantic neighbor to the south threatening to annex us and taking away our sovereignty and imposing tariffs on us and blah, blah, and so on. Considering that, it's astonishing that only some 67% of Canadians actually went to the vote. Now, obviously, this is a slightly provisional figure, but I don't think the final figure is going to be much different from this.
Yeah. If you could go back to that prior slide, Radhika. Sure. Last time we talked about the Canadian election, we were commenting on the fact that back in the 50s, you see when the voter turnout was up around 80%. The top marginal tax rate in Canada was up around 90%. So, which is just
maybe we should write a paper doing a correlation between marginal rates of taxation and voting turnout.
But it'd be interesting to overlay on this chart the decline in the top marginal tax rate, and I suspect you're going to find that it has followed a very.
I think it'll be a very exciting exercise.
Yeah. But the point being, that the policies of the government were much more egalitarian during the period when voter turnouts were higher. And as the policies of the government have become less and less egalitarian, more oriented towards the plutocracy, the elite, voter turnout has declined. People are becoming increasingly disengaged. That's the point I'm trying to make. And it is. I don't think that this election suggests that the trend has been reversed at all. As you've quite rightly indicated, given the stakes, one would have thought that the turnout would have gone through the roof, and we would have been up around the 1950s level, at least, if not higher. You know, the United States threatening to annex us openly is something that is unprecedented in our lifetimes, and yet we couldn't even get above the 70% threshold for voter turnout.
And, you know, it was interesting, before the actual election day came around, there was a, considerable reportage about how a lot of people had gone to advance polling. And so at that time, I thought, oh, well, this is going to be a very high turnout election. But turns out that it is not. So then one is forced to sit back and reflect on what all of that advance polling was about. And I think what it shows, and this is really interesting, is that the positions of the Canadian electorate have become entrenched. If you vote for the Conservatives, you're going to vote for them. You're not going to wait for the election campaign to finish before you just go and vote. So nothing is going to deter you from voting for the party that you have chosen. So I think the Conservative support base is certainly particularly strong and well consolidated. Meanwhile, I would say that probably those elements, because the advanced polling actually tended to on balance support the Liberals. We will come out we will find out in coming days whether, to what extent this was so. I'm sure there will be some studies done. But what that tells me as well is that that element of the electorate that was scared of Trump or Poilievre, as the case may be, because both of them, they went out and voted in the advance polls.
Yes. I think that's right. And one other thing I want to say about the Liberals, I'm going to share with you a story. Maybe at some point I told you this privately, but I have never really told the story publicly. When I was a partner at, a law firm in Ontario that specialized in class actions, one of my partners was a character by the name of Mike Azinga, who was the president of the Federal Liberal Party under Paul Martin. And so, at the time that Paul Martin was the Prime Minister of Canada, he was the president of the Liberal Party. And a good friend of his was Steve McKinnon, who is now an Ottawa area MP for the Liberals and is the Minister of Jobs and Families. And we went out to dinner once, the three of us. And at that point, I had just become engaged this was like 2009, I think. I'd just become really engaged in Green Party politics. And over a glass of wine, they looked at me with a grin on their face. And they said, we can't understand why you're engaging with the Green Party of Canada. And I found this question very curious. And I looked at them and I said, well, because its values accord with my own. I mean, why would you think that I would support this small little party? Obviously, that should be obvious to you. I said, why do you support the Liberals? And they said, almost in unison, because we win.
Yes.
That's it, because we win. Now, let's fast forward to the future. The one thing about the Liberal Party is they are masters of manipulating the public discourse and understanding what it takes to win. So you talked about how they basically plagiarized the platform of the Conservative Party. I would wager a large sum of money that when Justin Trudeau was thinking about resigning, was being pressured to resign, very, very influential people within the Liberal Brain Trust went to Justin Trudeau with polling data. And they said to him, look, you're going to lose. And if you allow yourself to step aside and Mark Carney replaces you, we're going to win. Here's the polling data to prove it. And this is the strategy we're going to employ. They had it all planned out before Trudeau announced his resignation. We are going to, associate Poilievre as much as possible in the minds of Canadian voters with Trump. It's all going to be Trump, Trump, Trump. We are going to take away those aspects of our policies that Poilievre has been attacking relentlessly, like the carbon tax. We're going to give up on that. We're going to give up on that modest increase on the capital gains tax. And our polling data shows that this will carry us to victory. But if you stay there, we're going to get slaughtered. And so I think this was all thought out and was assessed using sophisticated polling before Trudeau actually made the announcement. And then it was just a question of implementing the plan. Once Trudeau was out there.
I'd say two things to that. I think what you say sounds very plausible for this reason, that the revival of the Liberal Party after, it sank into its doldrums after the whole Chrétien-Martin rivalry and the golf ball thing and whatnot, the accusations against Chrétien for, Martin seemed to be willing to destroy the party in order to just get back at Chrétien. But anyway, after those doldrums, essentially what the Liberal Party establishment, which consisted, I think, of a number of Liberal grandees, including people like David Dodge, who'd been governor of the Bank of Canada, and of course Chrystia Freeland was part of all this. They decided that they had nothing to lose and that they would essentially put forward as progressive a platform as they could possibly manage. They threw everything in the kitchen sink behind that effort. They promised to spend their way out of the recession. There were going to be no limits on spending, blah, blah, etc. And of course, for this sort of platform, what they needed was some kind of an attractive front figure. And of course, who better than Justin Trudeau? People think he looks nice. After all, he evokes the memory of his father. So what's to lose? So they put him there. He was essentially a front man for this cabal. And so what you're saying is the same sort of cabal went into action again. And I believe you are right. But at the same time, I'd complicate your story by adding a wrinkle into it. Just before Chrystia Freeland resigned, I think that I know, that's right. Just before she resigned, she was essentially told that she was being transferred out of her position as finance minister and given some more minor ministry. And apparently this was so that the finance ministry would become open for Mark Carney. And there were reports in the press that Trudeau was going to ask Carney to be his finance minister. And I think that Carney is probably more than just a front man. I think he's a profoundly ambitious man who knew that that if he refused to be finance minister, Trudeau's finance minister, he could have a shortcut to the prime ministership. And I think that's what he decided to take.
You may be right about that. You may be right. I would, but I'm quite sure also that the people who gave this advice to Trudeau had decided that Chrystia Freeland was unelectable, and that was she was totally I see her as, when it comes to unlikability, I see her as being on par with
on par with Poilievre. And I guess, I'd say, but certainly, I mean, that may be true, but at the same time, it makes particularly ironic the fact that I have absolutely no doubt that in drafting her resignation letter, she had her eye on the leadership. She wrote it in such a way that it was absolutely a sort of manifesto for her leadership campaign. So
100%. But I don't think that the people who actually exercised power within the Liberal Party believed she was a credible candidate, and she was doomed from the beginning. She got absolutely crushed in the Liberal leadership contest.
Well, certainly once Mark Carney came on the scene, there was really no, because I think that, as I say, he has certainly, and we talked about this before, he certainly played this thing about, having handled crises. He was here for Brexit and in Canada for 2008. And it's really interesting that, as I think we've discussed before, number one, Mark Carney couldn't do anything to prevent Brexit, although he tried to, but there was nothing he could do to prevent it. And secondly, in the case of Canada in 2008, there was hardly any crisis to resolve. So all this credit with which he is showering himself is completely, how can you say, unjustified. The fact of the matter is that, the Canadian banks, thanks to regulations left over from the past, simply had been unable to invest in the toxic securities that the US was generating at that time, and therefore were hurt much less. So,
Absolutely.
and the other thing as well is that Stephen Harper came out and said, about Carney, that he had actually done nothing, and that it was the Harper government that was handling everything and so on. So this is really interesting, and maybe we should just wind up, and maybe I'll say one thing and then allow you to have the last word. So, in sort of wrapping up, I just find it ironic, that the whole world is hailing this election as historic, fourth term and remarkable turnaround in the fortunes of the Liberal Party and all that. But for all that, actually, in terms of both, in terms of the number of seats in Parliament, the situation today is not much different from the situation 3 days ago or whenever before the election. That is to say, the dial has not budged that much. In terms of vote shares, yes, this election has caused the collapse of all the other political forces, and the two main parties have benefited from it. But it seems to me that that the result is only going to exacerbate the trend, which is really no solution to any of Canada's problems, in which on the one hand, you have a sort of globalist establishment, which is today will be in power with a Mark Carney government, and an insurgent right wing, which is even more neoliberal and even more maverick than them, rather scary and deeply right wing. And between these two, there is nothing to choose. And unless there is a genuinely progressive left wing force that emerges, I don't think that Canada's problems are not going to be solved. And it is Canada's problems are not irrelevant to the rest of the world. It's not just that Canada is some peculiar thing. Across the Western world, these are the two main political forces in contention. And it seems to me that unless some forces break this deadlock, we are going to remain in this pattern of progressive deindustrialization, impoverishment, international aggression and imperialism, and all of that comes with it, and absolutely no way to address the problems of ordinary people.
100%. This is not going to arrest or even slow the decline of Canada economically, politically, morally, or of any other Western country that goes down this path. The one good thing I would say, Radhika, is that out of this carnage, perhaps will emerge a true determination on the part of the left, what remains of the left, to pursue a truly radical agenda, as we tried to do in 2020 and came so close to winning with. Okay, now it is the time for radical politics, and people have to have the courage to be radical and to be proud about being radical. And hopefully the base and the establishment of the Liberals, of the Greens and the NDP and others out there who ascribe to radical politics but are disaffected by the parties that have occupied Parliament for the last several decades, hopefully they will now come together out of this wreckage of an election and demonstrate the kind of political and moral courage that we desperately need. I hope so. And I certainly will do my part, as I know you will, to contribute to that happening.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think that's the great words on which to end. So thank you very much. And hopefully we'll do some other shows on some other subjects, or who knows, we might have yet another crisis in Canadian politics to deal with before soon, if you and I are right about what this election result means. So thanks very much, Dimitri. It was always a great pleasure as usual. So, and yeah, see you soon.
Take care, Radhika.